You're listening to the Studio PTPO podcast, where we talk all things marketing to help you build and grow your business online. Welcome to the latest episode. Welcome to the Studio PTPO podcast. We are back, and we're back at it again with another guest, a great guest. This is super exciting. We haven't done a Studio PTPO podcast in a little while, so this one is super exciting. Neil Morden, my man, what has happened? How you doing over there?
I'm doing excellent, Cody. And yeah, we have a really special guest on today. It's one of my favorite podcast shows I listen to fairly religiously on CBC Radio. It's called Under the Influence, and it's just a phenomenal show about advertising and marketing, the backstory behind some of the most iconic campaigns. It's a phenomenal show. And I know people that even have a passing interest in advertising and marketing. Love this show. So Terry, kudos to you for doing that show. You are also a broadcaster. You are also a public speaker, author. Thanks for coming on the show today, Terry.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. Terry, I wanted to talk a little bit about your backstory and your journey. So obviously you have a passion for marketing and advertising. You went to Ryerson, studied in the RTA program. A professor once gave you 4 out of 10, which goes to show that it doesn't really.
That's right. On my very
what's that?
A 4 out of 10 in radio on my very first project on my very first week at Ryerson.
What did that tell you?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, that's the irony of it all, because I end up spending my career in radio. So that was very fun.
Yeah, it's again, it happens to people on the journey that often you're fueled by people who tell you you're not going to be able to do something, and that fuels you as much as people say you can. Terry, after Ryerson, went on to become an award-winning copywriter for several agencies in Toronto. Then started his own company, audio production company called Pirate Radio and Television, which became one of the largest in Canada. But before we get to that, I want to hear a bit about your journey in that period in your life. Did you have, growing up in Sudbury, Ontario, did you have a passion for advertising, marketing? Did it start as a kid in high school? Sort of walk us through that, Terry.
Well, I have a funny story about that, because when I was 4 years old, I was on Romper Room. So you might not remember that show. You might be too young, but it was this kids show that aired every morning, that lots of other kids watched. And after one of those episodes, a director went up to my mother and said, "Would you mind if we use Terry in a commercial in the studio next door for a local bakery?" My mom said, okay. So they walked me over and they told me to stand beside this announcer. This is 1963, by the way. And there was a table set up there, and they gave me a sandwich, and they say, "Okay, Terry, all you got to do is eat a sandwich and smile." And the announcer beside you will talk about the bakery. So we did one take, and I just chewed my sandwich, and then we did another take, and I ad-libbed a line, which was, "Do I have to eat the crust?" Which made the director laugh out loud, which is a typical kid line, right? And he kept it in the commercial. And then that commercial ran in Sudbury for maybe 3 or 4 years. Old watching, at 7, I was still watching myself as a 4-year-old on TV. And I have to think somewhere in my psyche, and who knows, that advertising moment and that little bit of in years later that I wanted to pursue marketing and advertising as a career, but who knows?
Repetition in advertising does work, when Terry kept seeing himself.
No, that's right. That's right.
Terry, like it's been like, advertising, like when I think of advertising, I think of, like CBC Under the Influence, and you've done a lot of really, really cool things over the last the course of the history really of, your career in advertising. And I'm just really curious to know, because like we have a lot of work with a lot of small businesses, a lot of medium-sized businesses that are just really unsure of how to market themselves, what to do, what are the right steps to take. So I would love to, pick your brain around like what you think are like the 3 top tips for small to medium-sized businesses around, advertising and marketing. Like what should they know? obviously they listen to, CBC Under the Influence, that they'll get,
Yeah.
a whole bunch of information. They'll dive really deep. But like, what do you think are the most 3 common tips that just business owners, small to medium size, are missing? Because, it's really hard for them to play the brand game because, it can be it can be fairly expensive. Like, what are the 3 tips that you have for small to medium sized businesses in advertising?
I think, first of all, a small business needs a great marketing strategy. If you've listened to my show over 15 seasons, you'll have seen an evolution of my show, because it started out 15 years ago as a show about creativity, because I was a creative person my whole life. And then very slowly it morphed into a show on strategy, because the underpinning of any great campaign is a great strategy, an insightful strategy. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. So when Coffee Crisp, that candy bar, wanted to figure out a great strategy in the marketplace, because they had a lot of competitors. There's dozens and dozens of candy bars. They looked at the marketplace and realized that, of course, every candy bar positioned itself the same way, which was so they wanted to find their own little space in the marketplace. So what they did was they positioned themselves not as a treat, but as a snack. And you may remember this from your youth, where the slogan was a nice snack. But by doing that, a snack daily, a treat is weekly. And they quadrupled their sales just by positioning themselves as a snack and not a. And that's the kind of thinking that I think a small brand in the marketplace, that I can carve out the marketplace that I can own. And you can express that creatively. Then the second thing I would say is look for your greatest area of opportunity, because no huge advertising budget. So where is your greatest area of opportunity? Meaning, maybe it's not gaining new customers. Maybe it's getting your current customers to buy your product twice as often, or to use your services 3 times as much. What's the greatest area of opportunity? Then I would say the third thing is, once you've settled on a great strategy and you know where your greatest area of opportunity is to create bold marketing, because bold marketing can make up for a lack of budget. If you're bold, people notice you. You've created a brand image, a brand attitude. I don't mean sophomoric. I don't mean obscene. I mean just to be brave.
And how do marketers, how do small businesses become brave? Like, what is bold marketing? Like, can you dive a little bit into that? Like, what does that look like? What are tactics that, a small business, like, I understand, upsell, client retention, client upsell, but like, when you say bold marketing, what do you mean by that?
I mean, not. And I think most advertising is boring and safe.
Okay.
So when you see a brand that takes a chance, like I'll use some big examples, like Snickers. You're not you when you're hungry. I mean, that was a big, bold idea. Remember the first ad that ran in the Super Bowl that had Betty White being tackled by football players? I mean, she's like 87 years old. Like that was a bold thing to do, right? Because a lot of people would have said, don't do that. Old people won't like that. You're abusing elderly people. Like, they humor, and people loved it. Apple's a very bold advertiser. Nike's a very bold. There's nothing boring about their ads. There's nothing boring about what they have to say. Even IKEA, that ad that I love that still runs for years, where the woman thinks she's underpriced at the store, and she runs the car, start the car. Yeah. Because she thinks she's actually getting away with a product. Like, that was a bold piece of advertising, because a lot of people said, hey, she thinks she's stealing. It isn't that. She just can't imagine how low the price was, but that was a very bold thing for IKEA to do.
Right.
People know.
And Terry, speaking of bold, so one of Cody and I, we touch upon it on a lot of episodes. One of my favorite lines of all time was Buckley's, and you covered that in one of your shows as well. That one line, like, basically it tastes awful and it works, changed the fortunes of that company. Yeah. That was a very bold line, because it was confronting a negative. But cough medicine should taste bad, so they owned it, and it almost made you think, it is going to be more effective. It is going to get rid of my cough. Walk us through, what that line means to you and Buckley's, and how that, that was a resurgence of their brand, because they were way down in terms of sales. Weren't they number 8 or number 9? And then they just went all the way to number 2 or 1.
Remember that, like in the cough syrup world, they are one of the smaller players. It tastes awful and it works as a strategy, and But that was a great piece of marketing thinking because they looked at the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of cough medicines are flavored, right? So there's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, cherry flavored, you know, whatever it might be. They knew that their product tasted bad. They could have flavored it, right? I mean, that was actually leaned into the thing that made them different, which was that it tasted terrible. They leaned in, very brave, right? They leaned into it and said, there's a reason why it tastes terrible, because why it works. Like, it's not a candy. We're serious about this. We're serious about the ingredients. So that was great strategic thinking. It was bold strategic thinking. It has, and you know, the sign of a great idea when it lasts for years. And that has been their platform for maybe 30 years now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what can small and medium-sized businesses glean from these larger advertisers when it comes to advertising? You mentioned marketing strategy and like bold ideas. Like how can small to medium-sized businesses take these like grand, bold ideas and actually implement them into the marketplace? Like, and what do you feel like? Have you seen any small to medium-sized businesses implement really cool advertising campaigns, or like what advice would you give them to implement that advertising campaign that is bold and out there and really helps them, you know, attract a new audience or, you know, sell more? Like, what does that look like to you?
Well, it's kind of a case by case basis, of course, because it depends what the product is and, you know, what their goals are and what their strategies are and where their marketplace is. You know, I see, like, I look at the craft brewing business right now, and I see a lot of really fun marketing going on online. And that whole industry has really exploded. Like, even the crazy names of beers now, even that's a strategic choice, right? And very creative. And you can do a lot of creative things with when something's called Flying Monkey or whatever the brew is, right?
Barking Squirrel, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I see a lot of creativity happening in a category, remember, that was really owned by Molson and Labatt and Budweiser. True. End of story, forever. And that industry has really, you know, shown what bold marketing can do. I really think it comes down to everything I'd said earlier: a great strategy, bold creativity, but then, because you have a small budget, you have to be really smart about what your sweet spot is. Because you don't want to just, I would always say to my clients, don't go, I would rather dive into a very deep pool that's narrow, but deep. In other words, if it was radio, I wouldn't say buy 20 stations, because let's find out where our sweet spot is. Buy your product, there's probably a sweet spot that's probably like 25 to 34 or 34 to 47. Like, there's a sweet spot that the bulk is the sign of a smart mark, other than trying to appeal to everybody, which I think is what small marketers, the mistake they make, is they try to appeal to everybody with a small budget.
You're right, Terry. In this day and age, and it's more possible now to micro target than ever before with social media. You know, we run Facebook ad campaigns for clients across North America, Instagram ads. Like, you don't have to sort of throw shit at the wall anymore, so to speak, as you had to do back in the day with traditional advertising. Terry, I have a question about your show, because, you know, your show has become, you know, really a sensation, millions of downloads. CBC, people religiously listen to the show. What does it mean to you that this show has caught on to this extent? And give us a little bit of the backstory in terms of the production of the show, because it's very sticky. Like, there's things that resonate in terms of like the music that you play, the transitions. You always start with a story. You often make Beatles references. It's a very sticky show. What does it mean to you that A, it's become a sensation, and B, give us a little bit of the genesis and backstory for the production end of it?
Yeah, I always thought that, and I still do, that advertising is a fascinating industry. And that's how we pitched it to CBC originally. Very quickly, for years, I would do a creative radio seminar. I would rent a big theater in Toronto. I would invite 2 writers from across the country. And for 7 hours, I would get on a stage and teach them how to create creative radio. I'd give them every insight I ever gleaned in my career. I mean, I directed over 14,000 commercials.
Wow.
So I saw every brilliant solution, every terrible dead end. And I just gleaned all of that and just gave it to them in a seminar. And then a friend of mine said, "No, that seminar you do would make a great radio show." I said, "Who would ever run that?" And he said, CBC is going to run advertising. And he said, I think they'd run your show. And we had a good laugh. And then I couldn't get that thought kept that maybe he was onto something. So myself and Mike Tennant, who was at that lunch, we're thinking CBC would buy it. We knew it was a long shot, a fascinating business because it's a study of human nature. And there's nothing more interesting and fascinating than human nature. And I said, we're working ad men in the trenches. We're not journalists. We are working ad men who know what we're talking about, and we have access. Advertising industry works. Just open it up and say, this is how we think. This is how we make decisions. These are why this campaign works and why this commercial you hate the most sells the most product. Here's why. And CBC said, we'll take it. Which shocked us because we really thought the meeting would go the other way. Something like, interesting idea, not for us, but maybe we can do something else together. We thought that might lead to a fun project, but they took that show, and that's which was originally called we thought they took us on for summer replacement show when one of their big shows went off the air for the summer. So we were on the air for 8 weeks. They got so much good feedback, which was shocking to us from CBC listeners, right? The feedback was so curious and so wonderful and so kind that they kept us on the whole year, cut to 15 years later on the CBC. So that's how that started. The production, your other question is interesting because I believe that great radio shows and great podcasts have to not just be great content, but they have to be great sonically. In other words, it has to be great audio. It has to be a great listening experience beyond the content, beyond the interview, beyond, whatever the theme of the show is. So we spend a lot of time doing that, as you know. So we have an original theme song written for our show. We didn't just pick up a piece of stock music. I want to set the table for the theme. And then we go along, there is music, transitions, there's commercial clips, news clips. I bring in actors sometimes to do funny little bits for us. It takes us 12 hours to assemble and mix a 27-minute show every week.
Wow. That's incredible. Like 27 hours. So like, I guess like the biggest
12 hours to record it.
12 hours to record it. Okay. So
yeah, a 27-minute show. Yeah.
27-minute show, 12 hours to record. That's almost like, that's half a day. Half a 24-hour day. So like what advice would you have specifically for people that are just starting maybe like a podcast? Podcasts seem to be the new sexy thing. Like you mentioned audio on point. You mentioned, well thought out, being more than just the content. Have you picked up anything over the 15 years that you're like, yes, you need to actually absolutely 100% do this, this, and this? Like what advice would you have there?
Well, we've started a new podcast company, by the way, called the Apostrophe Podcast Company. It's not just production, but it's actually a network. Mm-hmm. So Under the Influence is part of that now. And we have, we regret to inform you, and we're rolling out a true crime show, and we've got 3 or 4 other shows coming on board. So we're right in the weeds when it comes to podcasting. I would say the biggest thing that I would say to a young podcaster is really plan out every episode. Mm-hmm. Don't just turn on a mic and interview somebody and turn it off and post it. I mean, even if it's an interview show, edit the interview. Like, make it smart. Take out the boring parts or the ums and the ahs or whatever it might be. Just make it a really smart, tight show. But plan out every episode. Like, really think about the beats. Think about what you're trying to communicate, and then figure out a structure for that show or for that episode. And I think planning is the biggest part. I mean, we sit down, we put so much time into the planning and structure of our shows. It's the biggest part of what we do almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I noticed that too, that the packaging is so important behind it. It's not just the content, but so kudos to you and your production team. I want to talk about social media. Our companies are based around social media, really. Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. We've basically grown our modern agency around those platforms. Yep. What does social media mean to you, Terry O'Reilly, as a brand? Because I see you as a brand, and Under the Influence as a brand. So your Twitter following, I think you have 31,000 followers. Instagram, you hit 10,000. I'm not sure if you're on TikTok yet, but what does social media meant to Terry O'Reilly in terms of your outreach to a new audience and existing audience?
time. You can spend money on social media, but you can also spend time on social media. And it's a cliche now, but it's true that it's a great place to build a relationship with your fans or your listeners. We're having a constant conversation with listeners. It is a constant conversation. They're commenting on the shows. They send me great episode ideas. They say, "Hey, Terry, have you ever considered, covering this topic?" And I'll think, "Oh, what a great topic that is."
Yeah.
Or they'll send me an ad they saw on their travels. They say, I just got back from Germany. I saw this billboard. I thought you might like seeing it. And I would have never seen that billboard if they hadn't sent it to me. So there's a great back and forth with our listeners. Then when it comes time for me, if I've written a new book and I want to promote that book online, I can do that because I'm not just constantly selling online. We're just having conversations. So when it's time to sell, our followers are okay with it, because it's just part of the whole relationship, and it's not just a selling relationship. So I think brands have to remember that it's not just it's not hardcore selling on social media, right?
It's what Gary Vee would say his mantra is kind of jab, 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 hook, which he wrote about in his book, Crush. It's like, yeah, you're right, Terry. Everything can't be a sell. It's like give away free content or storytelling. And then eventually, okay, I have a book coming out now, or I have a new show coming. And you do that very well. It's a real kind of editorial ad balance. And it feels more editorial than ads. So yeah. Kudos to you. I have to ask as well about, the spin-off podcast, because you told me you're building a sort of a podcast network, and I've actually listened to a few episodes of the new show. Do you consider that a spin-off, the Rejection podcast? So I've heard the episodes so far with Lisa Kudrow and Lady Gaga. And where did that idea come from? Because that's a big macro too. Like, if we're going to do a podcast, how are we going to determine what we're going to focus on? What's the subject matter? What's the concept? Well, how did you choose Rejection for a podcast?
I wouldn't say it's a spin-off of Under the Influence, although I will say that a lot of the shows where I've talked about how, for example, an inventor comes up with something and I kind of track how they got their product on the marketplace and how they had to face rejection and then how they eventually got there and how it became a success, were always some of my favorite stories. And listeners reacted to those stories in a big way. So it came out of that, not consciously, but it probably did. But I am endlessly curious about people. I love biographies, are my favorite genre to read. I love the story of how did you start? How did you have to bang on doors? How much rejection did you have to face? How did you not give up? When you've got 31, like Stephen King, one of the very first episode of we regret to inform you, fascinating to me. So that's what we wanted to explore, is how did you deal with the 5 rejections leading up to the 6th one? Like, we wanted to know all of that. So
yeah, like, and that's perseverance, and it's really cool to have that understanding of, like, how do you kind of get to the next level. And like, I'm curious how you do that for, like, you tell a lot of stories through audio, but also through written, like you have a background in copy. I'm curious, like, to know, like, do you find that there's different nuances when you're storytelling through audio versus written? And like, how are you applying from a written perspective? Because like, when you go and write a book, like the communication method is a little bit different than the communication method when you're actually doing a podcast. Like, maybe walk us through those two processes and how they're different, but how they're very similar for you.
That's a very good question, because they are very different. Writing for the ear versus the eye. I think writing for the ear is the most difficult medium to write. I've always said radio is the toughest in the advertising world, is the toughest medium to write for. It's the medium most writers are afraid of, because they don't, at first glance, it looks like you don't have all the tools that a television commercial would have. You don't have casting and wardrobe and location. And whereas I discovered early that radio was actually the most freeing medium, because I was never limited by budget. I could be on the moon in a commercial. I could be at the bottom of the ocean. I could be in a heart valve. And all you needed was great writing and some great production and a bag of sound effects to really do it. So when you write for the ear, when we write for podcasts, we really try and really paint with sound and paint with words, choosing just the right word, the right nuance. In print, run into, which is the biggest difference, is when you're using citations. Like, in other words, in a book, you can use footnotes, right?
Mhm.
So-and-so said this in Forbes magazine, and so-and-so said this in Time. You can't do that in a podcast, because that would make a podcast really difficult to listen to. At the same time, you have to use citations. You can't just lift people's lines. So we had to figure out a way to do that by casually, referencing a citation, or if it got too much, then at the back say it's all in the show notes. So that was a big difference. And quoting people, what they say is easily handled in print and more difficult in audio. So lots of different changes, lots of different techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I have to you referenced Stephen King earlier, and Carrie and all the rejections. I have mentioned this in a past podcast, but On Writing is a phenomenal book. Assume you've read it, Terry. I highly, highly recommend it just as a leisure read, but also to anyone who wants to get into that world of writing. And he was very disciplined, and Cody, to your point, resilient, and never gave up. And, people think that you can just get up and write and become an overnight success and write when you want to, but it was one of the best books on writing I've ever read. Another one I read, you referenced Nike briefly earlier, was Shoe Dog, a phenomenal book. And, I just want to finish up here by talking to you about what in your mind makes an iconic brand. Like, say Nike, Phil Knight wrote, I didn't want to just create a brand. I wanted to create sort of a movement, an idea, a spirit of the times to get in the zeitgeist. And did he just get lucky, or what in your mind over the years do you really think are the key ingredients? Is it luck, timing, beta testing different ideas? What is it in your estimation, Terry?
That's a good question too. It's all of those things, by the way. I think Nike got very lucky when they met Wieden and Kennedy. I think that's, Wieden and Kennedy is probably the best advertising agency in the world, and has been for many years. They're the Nike agency, of course. I think when Phil Knight met Wieden, they both said, which is interesting, they both hated advertising, even though Wieden was in advertising. So I think that was a big part of their success, is they hated typical advertising. So Wieden saw in Knight an opportunity to do something really unusual. And Knight saw in Wieden somebody who wasn't going to do it the usual way. So there was a simpatico of attitudes there. But I think, Apple, with Apple, I always say Steve Jobs. I worked for Chiat Day. Chiat Day was my last agency before starting Pirate, and Chiat Day was the Apple agency. And I worked with Lee Clow, who worked with Steve Jobs. And what Clow told me was that Steve Jobs met with the agency every Wednesday and spent the day with them. How many CEOs in the world spend one day a week with their agency? Zero. But that's why Apple was so good, because he really spent time. He brought them into rooms where nobody was allowed to see what they were working on, so they could see the future, and then come back Cloud to present the work right to Steve Jobs in the meeting firsthand. So I think the relationship between an owner of a company, and if there's a director of marketing too, and the agency is really what creates incredible marketing. It's the relationship, the trust. You have a backup right to the top office. Bring the CEO in, see if she likes the work too, that she's on board with your thinking. Creating relationships is really key in marketing. And
it matters.
It matters, and it can't be us versus them. It has to be us all together. And you can only do that by truly putting effort into forming a relationship.
I have to ask as well, did you ever cross paths with Ogilvy, David Ogilvy? He's an advertising legend, wrote a book called Confessions of an Advertising Man. Yeah, sorry.
there
you wrote one of my favorite lines, tell the truth, but make it fascinating as well. But what's your lens on David Ogilvy, that book, and did you ever cross paths with him?
I'm a big fan of David Ogilvy. I worship at the altar of Bill Bernbach of DDB, but I admire David Ogilvy, because Ogilvy was a man of rule, Bernbach was a man of anti-rule. So they came from very different parts of the spectrum. I love Ogilvy because he brought class and taste to advertising. They both started, Ogilvy started in 1948, DDB started in 1949. Very interesting that they came up in the same era, but very different agencies. I love Ogilvy's analysis of the business. He was also a great essayist because he wrote many books, not just Confessions of an Advertising Man. Bernbach never wrote one, which is interesting. I never crossed paths with David, except that I just recently learned, which was very funny. We wrote a house ad for an advertising agency I was working at in 1985, and we did a play off Ogilvy on Advertising because, his classic book, Ogilvy on Advertising, it's got a classic cover. We did an sort of an anti-Ogilvy house ad for the agency, and I wrote it, and it was called on the cover, and we called it Brezhnev on Advertising. Now, Brezhnev was the lead at the time, and the copy was, "We don't follow rules. Like we're anti-rules." So it was a kind of a fun poke at Ogilvy's work, at Ogilvy's book rather. I recently learned that, and David wrote back, and he hated it, of course, but they recently sent me the letter that Ogilvy wrote about the ad I wrote, which even though he hated what I did, I love that he'd even seen it.
Yeah,
exactly. That was the closest I got to David Ogilvy.
Yeah, and that book was probably the best advertising book ever written in terms of attracting clients to his own agency, and he admitted that.
Oh,
it was like a pioneer version of content marketing, right, if you will.
Yeah.
So like
That's right.
Yeah, he was the best. Cody, do you have anything to add here as we wrap things up? This has been phenomenal episode.
The only thing I want to add is, like, anyone listening back to the replay, go and listen to Under the Influence. Terry is a pioneer when it comes to really advertising advice. And I still very vividly remember a podcast you did on the, psychology of price. And that's, we as partners, business partners sat down and we're like, okay, we really need to reevaluate our pricing structure after all listening to that podcast. And I just, more than anything, I just want to say thank you for your time, Terry. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to chat today about advertising, something I'm super passionate about, marketing, copy, all that good stuff. So more than anything, I'm just super grateful for your time. And anyone that is listening back to the replay, you definitely want to check out his podcast, Under the Influence. Just do like he's doing research on other people that have come up before. Do some research around Terry. Really absorb his stuff, because me and Neil have absorbed Under the Influence over the last year. It was actually Neil who put me on the Under the Influence, and really just more than anything, I have so much gratitude and so much thanks for you taking the opportunity to chat with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having a great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Awesome. And thank you for tuning into the Studio PTPO podcast. We will see you soon.